Okay, so we'll have a look at the curtain wall types. I'm just going to kind of highlight the two main types. There are actually three, but two of them are kind of a repeat. So I'm going to talk about first the really basic type, and that's found by going to the Architecture tab, clicking on the Wall tool, and then in the Type selector in the Properties window, dropping down, and we're going to choose just this regular curtain wall type. So this is the very most basic form of the tool. A more elaborate version of the curtain wall tool we'll look at later with Storefront. But just so that I can kind of explain the sort of essential parts of this, start with just the regular curtain wall tool. And as we've mentioned before, good practice up here to just set the height and bind it to a level. So this curtain wall object will go from level 1 to level 2. And then just for the sake of this initial easy demo, just put one extension of curtain wall into your scene like this. It's going to look really, really simple, and we'll kind of build it up, make it a little bit more complex. If I go to a 3D view, I'll see here that I've got just that one really thin wall. Essentially what I've got here is just this really thin sheet of glass. Okay, I'm just going to change my detail level down here at the bottom from coarse to fine, and just for the sake of a little bit more of a clear graphical sort of display on screen, I'm just going to change my visual style to shaded, and now it takes on that slightly blue tone. So again, just kind of representing a pane of glass here. Now let me give you a little bit of background on exactly what curtain wall is all about. I'll just do an unprompted Google image search here, not always a good idea. So if you've looked downtown in any sort of major North American, or I guess we could say Western civilization type city, for many, many decades, buildings have been constructed this way with curtain wall. And the idea with curtain wall is that it is a non-load bearing wall. So when we look downtown, for example, we might notice that everything looks like it's a window, it's all glass. And it's a little bit of an illusion because, of course, some of those glass panels are transparent, view panels as they're called, and some of them are opaque spandrel panels. So here's a good example. We'll use this one. And the opaque spandrel panels obviously cover up what's behind, which is typically a floor plate, and then the transparent view panels obviously give you a way to look out and let a little bit of light in. Generally speaking, the case, or the pattern, I guess, back a couple decades was to just have them kind of look the same, so it looked as though the whole building was just made of the same glass. The idea behind curtain wall, of course, is that it's a non-load-bearing wall. It could technically mean other types of walls, but generally it means these kind of glass panel type walls that we see on high-rise buildings in downtown cores. So the way that Revit mimics that is that it gives you initially this large panel of glass. Now pay attention as you hover over this to that temporary highlight that you get when you kind of hover over the edges of it. Notice that you get this set of blue dotted lines, this kind of bounding box. It's important to pay attention to that because as we begin to sort of add the complexity to this curtain wall, there's going to be more and more objects that we can select, and that's going to make it more difficult to actually select the object that we want. So just like what we saw with the default walls, I have the ability with the grips, these little blue dots on the edge, to change the size or the length of this wall. And if I want to kind of eyeball it and change the height, I can use these little grips on the top and the bottom. I can also be a little bit more accurate and use the properties here in the property window to be a little more specific about how high I want it to be, where I want it to start, where I want it to end, and that sort of thing. So there are a lot of similarities here with just the regular default walls, but this is where it's going to start to get a little different. So with my large pane of glass, I can begin to add detail by selecting curtain grid. So on the Architecture tab, Build panel, if I select curtain grid, what I do is I add these little articulation points, or seams, I guess you could say, to kind of break up that large glass curtain wall panel. Notice that as I hover over the top and the bottom, it gives me the option of doing a vertical grid line. If I hover over the right or left side of my wall, it gives me the option of doing a horizontal grid line. And this is all done in anticipation of eventually putting some framing elements on these grid lines. Those are called mullions. I'm not trying to say millions, it's just M-U-L-L-I-O-N-S. So mullions will eventually be placed on these grid lines, and then I'll have something that looks more like a typical sort of high-rise curtain wall. So just drop a few of those in there. Pay attention to the temporary highlight or the temporary dimensions that are meant to have you place something a little more accurately. It can always be edited after the fact. But once you've placed a few grid lines, once again, just kind of drag your cursor over the wall and pay attention to what sort of temporary highlights you get. So now, in addition to the temporary highlight for the entire wall that you can see here, if I go further into the wall, notice that it gives me that kind of blue dotted line highlight on each one of these grid lines. So we're starting to see that within this wall there are many sort of subcategories of objects, things that we can select. And when, as I said, we need to kind of change the size of the panels, we do that by clicking on the grid and then changing the numbers, the dimensions that you see listed here. All right, we're going to add some framing elements then, some mullions. So on the same architecture tab, on the build panel, select the mullion tool. And you can do this either by clicking on individual grid lines, or a little bit less tedious would be to just select all grid lines. So just for the sake of a quicker demo, let's click on all grid lines. And then as you hover over any one of the grid lines on that wall, you'll see that it highlights all of the grid lines. And when you just do your single click, it'll place those aluminum, typically, mullion framing elements. And you can just kind of swirl that around in 3D and have a closer look to see what it's given you. So now, as you hover around your object, you'll notice that where we once had just a single selection option for the overall curtain wall, now we have grid lines, and we can also select mullions. And I didn't mention this one before, but we can also select individual panels. So we kind of have those 4 selection options. And as you would imagine, if I'm hovering over, let's say, this spot, it shows me a temporary highlight for the mullion. But let's say I want to select that individual glass panel, that curtain wall panel. No matter how much I try here to get my cursor in the right spot, I'm going to have a really hard time selecting that panel. So we're talking about curtain walls, but it's a good time to kind of introduce some other important conventions in Revit, namely the selection conventions. So if I want to select, let's say, that one individual curtain wall panel, I've got a couple different ways I can do that. And the first one I'm going to introduce you to is something that's often referred to as tabbing into an object. And what that means is if I hover over the edge and I see that temporary highlight for the mullion, all I have to do is hit my tab key, and I'm not holding it down, I'm actually tapping it, and you'll see that it shuffles between all of the objects that happen to be sort of lying underneath where I've hovered my cursor. So at this moment, if I clicked, I would get a mullion. If I clicked here, I'd get a grid. This click would give me the overall curtain wall, and this would give me the panel. So it's an important thing to be aware of in Revit, that we quite often have these really complex scenes with lots of overlapping geometry, and when we want to select the object that we really want to work on, we quite often have to use that tab key so that we can access it. So that's the one kind of first major selection method. Another option that we have is we can select, let's say, a set of objects, knowing that we can't quite get the one that we want, but within the batch, we'll be able to kind of refine the selection and just get that one curtain wall panel that we're after. The way that we do that is we make our initial selection window, and like AutoCAD, notice that if I select from left to right, only objects that fall entirely within that selection window get selected. If I go the other way, from right to left, anything that overlaps in any way, that selection box gets selected. So there's a bit of a time and a place for both. In this case, because I just want that one panel, I'm going to do the left to right. And what that will leave me with is a set of 5 objects, 4 mullions and 1 panel. And the tool that I'm going to use to refine my selection is the filter tool. And it appears up here on the ribbon. It also appears down here in the bottom right. And notice that down here in the bottom right, it actually displays a number. So it shows me the number 5, and that's my confirmation that I've got the 4 mullions and the 1 panel. If I click on the actual filter tool here, it shows me a list by category of what I've got selected, and it lets me know, once again, 4 mullions, 1 panel. If I don't want the mullions, all I have to do is uncheck this box, and now it shows me that I've got just the 1 curtain wall panel. Hard to see the highlight, but it has selected that panel. And what I can do now is I can change its type. So as I mentioned, on a typical curtain wall, you've got kind of a composition of transparent view glass panels, and you've got the opaque spandrel panels. So if I want to change this from the default the default view glass, the transparent panel, to something solid, I have the option over here in the type selector to pull that down and select System Panel Solid. And that will make it a solid spandrel panel. If you don't see this, if it's grayed out, it's because your panel is pinned. So just have a look. There will be a little leader line with kind of like a little thumbtack icon. If you see that, all you have to do is go up here to the ribbon on the Modify panel of the Modify tab and just click on this little button and it will unpin it or unlock it. I didn't have to do that in this case. I'm free to just change this from a System Panel Glazed to a System Panel Solid. I'll click an empty space to drop the selection, and now you can see that I've got that different type of panel. All right, so remember your selection sets. As I said, the tabbing or the select a batch or a set, and then use your filter key. And that's how we make selections on these really difficult, complex objects.